Greetings, people of Earth, and anyone else who might be listening in. I am several Layman Pascals, and this is the integral stage where we conversationally map the overlapping transformational, developmental, and regenerative spaces. And as some of you know, I do a lot of work on the odd frontiers of spirituality. Bruce and I are committed to integral post-metaphysical spirituality. I've developed the so-called integration surplus model of religion and spirituality. I lead the meta-modern spirituality labs. And at Limicon this year, I presented a structural overview of some of the major components I view as necessary for an approach to be both authentically spiritual and legitimately meta-modern. So I was excited and intrigued when I saw that my periodic pal, Steve McIntosh, had a presentation on post-postmodern spiritual pluralism. Not surprising, since we both love evolution, spirituality, inner growth, and the possibilities of cultural renaissance. And I figured it would be pretty good and pretty useful for us to have a discussion on the overlaps betwixt our approaches, and in part by zeroing in on Steve's proposal for 6 agreements around post-postmodern spiritual pluralism. So who better to explore that with than Steve himself? Hey, Steve.
Thanks, Layman. It's great to be with you.
Okay, we're going to do some slides before we get into those 6 agreements, but let's take a step back and investigate our general sense of this. Why is postmodern spirituality relevant? And what's your impression, if any, of meta-modern spirituality? And maybe to throw another thing in there, what do you suspect are the differences and similarities between you and I as thinkers in this space?
Well, sure. I think one of the things that you and I have in common is that we're both attracted to the possibility of a significant cultural emergence in the time ahead. Something that looks at least a little bit like previous renaissances in history, not just the European Renaissance, but the 60s, right? When the progressive postmodernism first emerged. And it's really, if we look at history, it's those periods of initial emergence where some of the best art is made and some of the most inspiring artifacts of the emergence kind of appear, right? So this early stage of, or early emergence of a cultural, I guess level is the best way to put it, is something that's drawn me to this kind of, this realm of culture, this subculture. I think right now there's a lot of terms flying around that are being contested. I think that's a positive thing. In other words, you've kind of moved to a set of terms. I've moved to a set of terms. The term integral seems like it's fairly exhausted at this point. It's hard not to fall into the pattern because I've been calling, what this next emergence is integral for 25 years now. But in the larger culture, we're trying to pay attention to the intersubjective agreements through which meaningful terms come into being. And so we can't just call it whatever we want. We have to pay attention to what people are saying. And that's where a certain amount of contestation among the terms is. But in terms of spirituality, what's the relevance of that? I would say that there's been spirituality, either implicit or explicit, at the heart of each one of these emergences in history. And I think that spirituality is indispensable. In other words, if this next cultural emergence is going to solve the problems of our time, or at least attempt to, or at least move in the direction, right, of a better society, a more flourishing society, a more pro-social society, then I would say spirituality has to be part of that. And at least, from even the most secular perspective, we can see how important that is for social solidarity. In other words, we don't need everybody to agree, but in order to facilitate or cultivate or garden for the emergence of this next step, we've got to get a critical mass of agreement. And around that agreement is an agreement, I would say, of higher purpose or deeper meaning, or what's often called transcendence. Transcendence is a kind of an umbrella term, and it can apply to both the thoroughly spiritual ideas as well as, more secular ideas of deeper meaning, to the extent that there are such. And so spirituality is important for the social solidarity. It's important for the sense of higher purpose that we're going to need to bring about this kind of movement. And I would say what attracted me to this kind of field of philosophy from the beginning was how robustly spiritual it was. I remember, or is, maybe, when I remember first reading Sex, Ecology, Spirituality by Ken Wilber, came out in 1995. I read it, a couple years after it was published. And at the beginning of the book, Wilbur kind of makes fun of scientific materialism. He calls it the philosophy of whoops. Whoops, there's a universe of 93 billion light years width and trillions of galaxies and humans that love each other and beauty and truth and goodness. I mean, the idea that this just came about, as an accident, or it's just inevitable, or it just is and that's all. I think that's a kind of magical thinking. And so, refining our spirituality, making it better, involves being aware of all of the pathologies that have attached to spirituality in previous periods. And I think one of our challenges is, it's almost cliche to talk about transcending and including. I think if we're going to transcend, we have to include. I always say that the degree of our transcendence is ultimately determined by the scope of our inclusion. So if we're going to transcend this current cultural milieu that we exist in at this time in history, we're going to need to include some very important elements of the larger structure of emergence that's giving us this opportunity, right, to participate in or at least, be in the vanguard. Whether it takes decades or even a century for this to emerge, we're talking about it, right? We're groping around trying to figure out what it looks like and what it's going to take, and that by itself is evidence that something is afoot, right? So I'd say spirituality is central. It's certainly central to my view, but I think if it's going to be central to a larger movement, then there's going to have to be pluralism, right? And in other words, that is, we're going to have to include more than one kind of spirituality, because I think it's fairly unrealistic to expect that this next great stage will be kind of united by a common religion, right, or a common belief system, right? So at least that's some thinking at the beginning of
Great,
it.
great introduction. So I'm going to make you the host, and let's take a look at these slides you've got. We
Okay.
get a sense of the concepts that you're using before we go any further.
Yeah, great. Just to kind of give folks. So, all right. So this is an abbreviation of an abbreviation. In other words, I've got this book which was published by Quest Books in 2015, called "The Presence of the Infinite: The Spiritual Experience of Beauty, Truth, and Goodness." And in there, I talk about, in with some depth and rigor, what I'm going to skim over here. And in February, like we mentioned, I did a presentation to my monthly Zoom group where I unpack this with a lot more detail than I'm going to do so now. So folks who are interested, for a more thorough explanation of this, can watch that YouTube video on our YouTube channel, Developmental Philosophy, it's called. Okay, so I'm going to play this slideshow. What do I mean by religion and spirituality, right? So in other words, religion by itself is often associated just with, traditional established religions. Spirituality is more generally associated with the kind of new age or progressive, but both of those terms, religion and spirituality, are bigger than any of those subcategories. So I generally treat religion and spirituality as directly synonymous. We can certainly tease apart some differences and define them with a degree of separation. But humanity's quest for, or personally and collectively, for what's ultimately real, I think that there ought to be a word that encompasses both of the whole thing. And neither religion nor spirituality are sufficient. But I'll go ahead and just use those as synonyms as I talk. So it's the feelings, thoughts, intentions, practices, and community affiliations that surround the attempt to make contact with ultimate reality. Now, there are, of course, many other academic definitions of religion, and maybe religion and spirituality. This is just to kind of get the ball rolling. I think a better way to define what I'm talking about is with this idea of the hermeneutic circle. And that is spiritual teachings, spiritual practice, and spiritual experience. And the idea here is that, a lot of folks, especially within progressive postmodernity, they their main focus is on practice. It's like, I don't care about the teachings, I just want to do yoga, right? Or I just want to meditate. And of course, much of those practices are for spiritual growth. And spiritual growth, I would say, to a degree, is predicated on some kind of authentic spiritual experience. And there's many, many kinds of spiritual experience. Indeed, that's what that book, The Presence of the Infinite, is all about, ultimately, spiritual experience. But it, as I've thought about it, I've really seen how spiritual teachings are kind of indispensable, even if they're de-emphasized, because the practices are enacted by the teachings. The practices they imply teachings, right? That the teachings determine not only the form of the practice, but the reason for it. And spiritual experience, likewise, when people have experiences and have had spiritual experiences throughout history, those experiences have informed and sometimes enacted spiritual teachings. So I would say that the hermeneutic circle idea is that these three basic elements of spirituality are interdependent and co-enacting or co-arising, and that even though we may just be after spiritual experience, and even though folks can certainly have spiritual experience without having considered any teachings or without having done any formal practices, to engage with religion and spirituality, ideally you're working with all three of these, that you're seeking spiritual experience, you're having it, it's causing your growth, and this growth is also, it's being nourished not only by the experience, but by the teachings itself. The teachings are very important. I would say there's no getting away from spiritual teachings, even if say we don't know, or we can never know, or we're in this vast mystery, so any spiritual teaching is bound to be bunk. I would say that by itself is a spiritual teaching. So just like philosophy itself, there's no getting away from it. Okay, so in The Presence of the Infinite, I talk about three major categories of spirituality within at least American culture. I mean, these categories, religious spirituality, obviously seen throughout the world and throughout, history, at least for the last couple thousand years. And it's really well known. But the reason that I'm dividing these kinds of spirituality, and I'll define each one here in a second, is that we recognize, I think, that within the loose agreement that you and I share, we recognize three major kinds of culture, three stages that are currently active. More stages, but at least three. Traditionalism, modernism, and postmodernism. Those are the general names which I use. There's also plenty of colors to describe them and all kinds of, contention about what these stages are. But just again, with a broad generalization, just we're talking about we recognize in history that the great religious civilizations have flourished throughout the world and in most parts of the world through over the last 2,000 years. And then beginning in the Enlightenment, we have this emergence of modernity, which is not entirely anti-religious, but it's dialectically different. It's pushing off against, religious authority, religious civilization. And within this emergence of modernity, there has been the rise of not just a kind of an accommodation of religion, but a thorough rejection of religion, right? Not everyone within modernist culture thoroughly rejects religion, but, going back, we could trace it to the ancient Greeks, but certainly with people like Hume or Comte or any of the Enlightenment atheists, if you will, they have kind of taken the rejection of religion as far as it can go to the point where they're just kind of denying spirituality's authenticity in general. But we can talk about the good and the bad of that. But again, these three major worldviews, the traditional worldview gives birth to religious spirituality and vice versa. The emergence of religious spirituality creates the traditional worldview, so they're co-creating. But the kinds of religious spirituality that we find that are arising within traditional culture, especially the ancient ones, these forms are not just fixed within the traditional worldview. They are lines of development that rise up through the worldview. So for example, Christianity, certainly perhaps the majority of Christianity in America is still very much rooted within a traditional worldview and a traditional values, traditional mores. But as a form, Christianity as a line grows up, right? So there are modernist expressions of Christianity, like Paul Tillich, for example. There are postmodern expressions of spirituality, like Richard Rohr. And there are that is this line of development grows, and obviously it's attempting to grow into this next level of culture that you and I are about. So religious spirituality, it contains lines, and it is still the largest form of spirituality by far, again considered as a general category, and I'll define it a little bit more, but these are the three. Secular spirituality, I'll defend the idea that a secular view is a form of spirituality, when you frame the universe and describe whether it's meaningful or meaningless, that's a direct stand-in for spirituality. So I'm going to argue in a minute why, Bill Maher once said that atheism is a religion like abstinence is a sex position, right? But atheism's still a faith, right? With all the vast mystery in which we find ourselves, the idea that you're absolutely certain that there's no such thing, that's a kind of a belief system. People have loyalty to it. It defines their identity. We see, that at least crude form of secular spirituality over the last 20 years has been very successful in our culture. There are other more refined versions of it. So again, these are general categories, and there's a higher quality and lower quality forms within each of these categories. And then we have progressive spirituality, which it has a variety of names. Progressive spirituality is certainly not an established label for it, but that's the one that I've been using for over 20 years now, and it seems to have a general resonance because, a lot of people put down progressive spirituality as New Age, right? And I would say that maybe in the 90s, the term New Age still could stand in for a definition of what that emergent form of alternative spiritual culture was. But now the term New Age has become a term of derision, standing for the most magical thinking, the most kind of sort of lowbrow versions of alternative spirituality. But there are, again, along with these other ones, there are forms of progressive spirituality that are deeply, I would say, enlightened and insightful, and have much to give us, and things that we need to take seriously and respect. So, just to elaborate a little bit more. Religious spirituality includes the established religions that remain grounded, rooted in the traditional worldview. Secular spirituality includes atheism, religious naturalism, most forms of existentialism, secular humanism, Marxism for sure, scientism, emergentism, I'm not sure, but I'm throwing it in there. And then we have, of course, progressive spirituality, which includes many, many different kinds. But I just named some, right? So postmodern versions, right? So that there are, Buddhism and Hinduism, for example, in their native lands, are for the most part still grounded in a traditional level of cultural development, which is beautiful in its own right. But as these religions have been brought to the West and adopted primarily by progressive postmodernists who were seeking, a spiritual, enrichment in ways that didn't involve going back to the spiritual traditions of the West, because that they saw that would involve a sort of cultural regression, right? Like if we become born again Christians, we're going to become traditionalists. So in order to maintain the postmodern identity, finding forms of spirituality that were resonant but not the old form that not only was modernity in the process of transcending, but post-modernity still had to do some transcending too of the primarily Christianity and Judaism, but also other forms in the West. So I'll just keep reading here. Postmodern, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, also, the rising culture of psychedelics have been part of progressive spirituality from the beginning. That's one of the things that brought me into this culture in the 1970s was taking acid. It was like, wow, okay, there's much more going on here, and where can I find, cultural expressions of these insights? And it was within this thing I'm calling progressive spirituality. But it also includes ancient, indigenous, and shamanic religions. Of course, these are rooted in a pre-traditional culture, but the way they're experienced in today's world by the folks who are watching this video are very much postmodern versions of shamanism or indigenous spirituality And so, obviously these categories are not absolute. There's some overlap, there's some contradictions, but we're dealing with generalizations here. But I can also mention channeling, a big part of progressive spirituality, paganism, astrology, transpersonal psychology, feminist spirituality. What all of these disparate forms of spiritual teaching have in common is that they're all kind of brought together and contained within the progressive postmodern worldview and its mores and its values and its sort of membrane, right, of who's postmodern and who's not. So, barriers to spiritual pluralism. Okay, why do we need spiritual pluralism? Because we're not going to transcend without including more than one line, I guess is the short answer. And ultimately, I think if we view at least the major kinds of spirituality that I touched on, that if we recognize that many of those are lines that will, transcend the worldview of their origin and grow up into this next level, if we're going to welcome a variety of paths, I think one of the things that would we ideally do is we have to transcend earlier forms of pluralism, right? So even there were forms of traditional societies in the past, like in antiquity and some in the Middle Ages, where there was a dominant religion, but they tolerated other religions, right? They didn't have an inquisition until later. So there's a kind of tolerant, begrudging acceptance form of pluralism that exists even at the traditional level. And then we have modernity. We have religious freedom that's enacted in modernity's founding documents. The Constitution of the United States being the prime example. Religious freedom is part of the Bill of Rights, and that's a kind of formalistic, legalistic pluralism. But it certainly beats, oppression or persecution. And then I guess with postmodernism, we get another kind of pluralism. That's this kind of welcoming New Age embrace. But it's got problems too because it doesn't have any limiting principle. It doesn't have any way of purging magical thinking, or, there's no agreement to be critical among the different levels. They're all just kind of accepted. So New Age pluralism, I'll call it, is in some ways, it's a good step forward in some ways because it allows us to examine with an openness the wisdom of the ages that has only been recently assembled, right, through translation and through religious scholarship over the last 150 years or so. We now have assembled the wisdom of the ages that humanity's never had, this kind of treasure trove of historical spiritual realizers all in one place, where we can kind of read about their stories and listen to their teachings. And so progressive spirituality has done an important service in bringing those to the fore. But of course, it's kind of accepting relativism means that it is there's all support and no challenge, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. So ideally, we want to transcend, the kind of the New Age anything goes cultural acceptance, and that leads to understanding, well, what is it that what is this proposed social norm among those who are trying to feel their way into this next cultural emergence? What are the things that this social norm has to overcome? What are the challenges? And of course, the first one is fundamentalism, right? And we think of fundamentalism as, of course, Christian fundamentalism, biblical literalism. That's the most prominent form of fundamentalism. When we talk about fundamentalists, I mean, of course, there's, Islamic fundamentalists and Jewish fundamentalists and fundamentalists of all the great world's religions, at least most, I could say. But I would expand the understanding of fundamentalism to go beyond just the sort of familiar forms of religious fundamentalism and say that any form of theological or metaphysical certainty. And what I mean is that, okay, so I may have had direct spiritual experiences where we know for certain that this spiritual experience is the most real thing we ever experienced. It's thoroughly real. We're totally certain of it. And we not only know it in our hearts, but we have a direct experience of it, right? So I think that's a beautiful kind of spiritual, certainty. And I think that people can be certain in their hearts. But when it comes to a cultural space where we're actively entering into, a cultural frame where we want to be with others who don't share the same certainty regarding their own, they have different spiritual experiences, and they're certain of things which may contradict our certainties, right? So the idea that at least within the social norm of spiritual pluralism, recognizing that that at least collectively, we're still we're still trying to find an agreement that can that can give us some kind of unity, and we're still far from that. So a degree, avoiding fundamentalism of all kinds, I'd say, is the first element of the norm of spiritual pluralism. The second is reductionism, the idea of nothing but, right? Now, of course, there is both subjective reductionism and objective reductionism, but the idea of the old forms of idealism, like it was taught by Berkeley, for example, that that everything is subjective. I think that that's been fairly well transcended by most forms of, there's still plenty of idealism that we could point to, but the idea that it's all just subjective is a form of reductionism ultimately, because I think realism is important, and if you are a subjective idealist, it's if you're a reductionist in terms of subjectivism, then I would say that is a challenge to pluralism, because other people are going to be realists or have other ideas about what the ontology of our reality is. So ultimately, reductionism comes down to the most prevalent form is scientific materialism, physicalism, naturalism. It goes by many terms, and there's been a within that culture, right? You have kind of hard, I would even say crude materialists, somebody like Richard Dawkins, but then you have others who are still loyal to secular spirituality, but have tried to nuance their physicalism, right? And say, look, we still want to be loyal to this deep intuition that there's the science can deliver the truths of the universe, and that we need to purge our philosophy of magical thinking, which includes most spiritual propositions. And so, although there's many kinds of physicalism, and there's been attempts to try to bootstrap, from physicalism, it is ultimately, if you're reducing the world to merely the physical, or if you're saying that reality is causally closed, and that the only causes and effects are can be ultimately reduced to the laws of physics, right? So that there's that consciousness is kind of an epiphenomenon. It doesn't have causal efficacy. That free will is kind of an illusion because our consciousness is being, in a sense, determined by our physical brains. And I would say that, reductionism is not compatible with spiritual pluralism, not only because it's philosophically incoherent, and I think has been thoroughly refuted at this point by, philosophers of mind. I think it's a kind of a dying creed, but also because it's hostile. It creates a culture of contempt for both religious spirituality and progressive spirituality, in a way that one of the spiritual practices of secular spirituality, at least among some of the practitioners of it, is debunking, right? They're going to debunk all the miracles. They're going to debunk all the spiritual truth claims. But one of the things that vitiates against reductionism is the idea that there's an interior universe, that there's a subjective ontology that can't be reduced to the physical, that there's not just that, but there's an intersubjective ontology, that is there's a we space that has real systems, and there's real things in there, and those impact the physical world in undeniable ways. And if we try to say that that's all just physical, it becomes, again, philosophically incoherent pretty quickly. So I would say that that fundamentalism needs to be challenged, and reductionism, especially the reductionisms of physicalism, need to be challenged. And then, of course, another one, a little bit more subtle, I would say a barrier to spiritual pluralism, is this idea of perennialism. This is the idea that there's kind of one spiritual truth, and which I think ultimately that's true, right? I'm not so much a pluralist regarding spiritual truth claim. I think there is a unity of truth in the universe, but I don't think that the human culture or human consciousness, at least at this point in history, and perhaps never, is going to be able to see this with sort of naked objectivity or naked clarity, right? Again, we can have deep mystical experiences, and those are probative. I mean, mystical experiences certainly need to be honored and included, but there's all kinds of mystical experiences. And the idea that there's just one form of mystical experiences that the mystics throughout the ages have been getting at, and we can rank it and look at it empirically. Personally, I reject that, and I'm not the only one. I think there's all kinds of problems with perennialism. I think it leads to a kind of belief system imperialism, meaning that many of the champions of perennialism have basically said that there are, Schuon, for example, Fritjof Schuon, his idea early on was that there's a basic unity of all world religions, and that he explained that there was the exoteric, religions, which were the rituals and the mythic, and the smells and bells, and all the different, peculiar institutions of the different religions. And then there was esoteric religion, which was sort of the heart of all these religions. And they, this esoteric was almost like a science of spirit. Like if we just follow the mystics and we catalog their reports, then we're going to see with clarity what the empirical spiritual reality is. And I think it's a beautiful idea. I think that part of it is caught up in the attempt to transcend Christianity, right? This is like a 500-year project in Western civilization, and so trying to find this core of all religions, which just happens to be thoroughly non-dual. And that is that's something I think that further scholarship on what the mystics actually say from people like Jorge Ferrer, for example, have shown that it's a dogma, and that ultimately perennialism, we might have a future form of it, but what passes for it now is just ultimately a kind of New Age spirituality. So okay, so these are the proposed elements, or the agreements that were, caught your interest, and we could certainly debate these. So I'm just throwing these out, I'm proposing them. I'm seeing if we can create agreement around these, and if not, okay, well, let's continue to talk about it. Let's debate it, right? So again, the social norms are not, just like handed down with authority or declared by fiat. They're forged through agreement and debate and a certain amount of contestation. And I think that one of the things that a functioning social norm of spiritual pluralism could do is it could create a we space within this emerging culture wherein there's a degree of challenge and support. In other words, that there's the competition, the natural and in some ways healthy competition between these different lines of spirituality as they attempt to grow into this next level. It can true up the different lines, right? That is, the challenge can purge the magical thinking, both the materialistic magical thinking and the religionist magical thinking, but it can also see where the challenge goes too far. In other words, if there's this sense in which your thinking or your spiritual experiences are full of shit, or you haven't transcended, or you're down there at some lower level just pretending to be postmodern, then that's obviously not an environment of support. And what are the contours of support? It's a working of polarity, right? Many of your viewers will be familiar with a polarity, theory, and how when you have dialectical differences, you have both, truths and untruths, but you also have truths and truths, at least in many cases. And when you can kind of factor down, so to speak, to the nub of goodness that exists on both sides of the dialectic, this allows you to work with a positive polarity wherein each side can true up the other. That is, the value creating capacity of each side in a positive polarity is partially determined by the moderating influence of its polar counterpart. And so recognizing that there is this container in which there can be legitimate differences, that creates an environment of support in which challenges can be effective, where they can be more than just dismissals, where they can be reduced of their hostile emotional content and their defensiveness, and be brought into relations so that That they're allowing that none of these lines has a monopoly on the truth. That there's some truth of religious spirituality, that it's getting at something real, and that the thousands of years by which spiritual realizers have been engaged in this culture of religious spirituality, that there's something to it. Now, of course, it's encrusted with all kinds of pre-modern concepts. It hasn't been thoroughly purified, but that's kind of what this process, one of the promises of this kind of challenge and support cultural agreement, is that we can uh, carry forward the best and prune away the worst of each of these lines of development, each of the secular spirituality, progressive spirituality, and the religious spirituality. So I'm saying welcome and honor the best, but the only way we can get to the best of each of these lines is to acknowledge and resist the respective pathologies of each line, right? And then, that what goes with that is this idea of epistemic humility, that again, we can have full-blown faith and certainty and loyalty and identity, with the spiritual teachings that really are our core belief. But again, we're searchers. We're seeking this whole worldview is a worldview of evolution. It's a worldview of growth, and so humility is a prerequisite to growth, right? If you know it all or you're certain, then there's no room to grow or learn more. So I would say epistemic, not just humility, but epistemic humility, and recognizing that intellectual arrogance regarding these things is not it's not commensurate with the norm that we need. Here's another related one, and that is know the difference between your belief system and established facts. I often encounter this within the New Age circles that I used to, participate in the 1990s. That the belief systems were just asserted as though there was agreement, like we all just agree. And you still see that within integral circles, like folks are trying to create agreements, which is understandable, right? What do we agree about? We all agree about this, of course. But that's an assumption, it's a projection, and I would say that it's still common. And so being aware of what your spiritual belief system is and where the collective agreement is at this time in history, there's a certain amount of honoring of the collective agreement that doesn't include empirical facts that stem directly from your belief system, right? Because they're not empirical. Okay, 5. This is the one we probably spend the most time talking about, right? And that is affirm the interior universe, value realism, and I would say even the universe's purposiveness. So I've been working on this book. I'm not announcing it here. It's being reviewed by a publisher now. I hope it'll come out by next year. But it's a philosophy book. It's really the culmination of my life's work in some ways. And in there, I argue for all of these things, with some degree of rigor. I've argued for them elsewhere. Wilbur's arguing. There's plenty of people in this space who have said, look, there is an interior universe, that it has its own authentic ontology. And it's not just the interior universe of our minds, it's also the interior universe of our culture. And I would say that what I'm calling ontological intersubjectivity, right? Social ontology, that in some ways it's trivial. Of course, we have a collective agreements. Of course, they impact our culture and our minds and how we go about our lives. But beyond the sort of trivial recognition that there are collective agreements and joint commitments, I would say there is that one of the things that enacts this next renaissance is a powerful new philosophy. The philosophy has breakthroughs in it. And one of the breakthroughs is this discovery of not just we space, not just metaphorical we space, but ontological we space, actual existing we space, where real systems can exist, like worldviews are not just contrived analytical categories. They're actually intersubjective systems, large-scale intergenerational systems. And when we think about it from a system science perspective, we can see that these systems have a metabolism, that they're part of their real systems because their values are kind of interior energy that are giving them life and making them powerful and intergenerationally extant. So the interior universe, I would say, it's a very crucial and foundational part of the new philosophy, which is, a critical part of enacting this next great phase of human history. But if you're a materialist, then you may not be facing the metaphysical facts, or at least maybe not facts is too strong. But if you deny that consciousness is real and not entirely an epiphenomenon, if you deny that there's this collective we space that has some ontological, heft, that there's something there, then I would say you're not going to be able to participate in the agreements that enact this next culture. Now, that's controversial. We could debate that, but let me just go through and I'll shut up here in a second. Value realism, right? Or sometimes called moral realism. This is the idea that what's good is not just whatever you think it is. It's not just a projection. That there is real meaning in the universe. That again, we said earlier that there's a unity of truth, and reality itself is enacted by the movement of truth. Right? Hegel said that truth is merely the dialectical movement, and I think it's a deep realization that I've really gained a lot from thinking about. But the good, the true, and the beautiful, I would say, are foundational to this philosophy. It's foundational to the spirituality, as I argue in my forthcoming book. The good, the true, and the beautiful form a kind of a cosmic attractor that gives postmodern spirituality its major superpower, because these are deeply spiritual realities, even though they're just philosophical concepts. They break out of their conceptual philosophical container because there's spiritual truth in there. And we can begin to really see how the philosophy of goodness, truth, and beauty illuminates transcendence when properly recognized, and that this can form the higher purpose that we need to grow into the next great phase. In other words, it creates spiritual solidarity without requiring spiritual conformity. And the good, the true, and the beautiful, again, has an ancient pedigree going back to, the ancient Greeks. And Whitehead, I think, is one of the most prominent contemporary or recent proponents of the good, the true, and the beautiful. And the more I progress in my own philosophical journey, the more I keep coming back to Whitehead, and Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, especially as what I see as the kind of the primary founders of this next great phase. That these their thinking forms very important foundation. It's been carried forward by other integral philosophers and process philosophers as well. But I would say the good, the true, and the beautiful. It's if you claim that those values, like many existentialist philosophers do, are merely subjective preferences, that they're purely subjective, that they have no ontology, that they have no real causal effect, other than on your own thinking, then I would say that that's a proposition, that's a form of reductionism that precludes that way of thinking from entering into this larger post-postmodern agreement regarding spiritual pluralism. But again, we could debate that. And then the purposiveness, right? So again, this is particularly challenging, I would say. There are not just materialists or physicalists who think that the universe is meaningless, right? Nihilists, all kinds of folks are saying that, the only meaning in the universe is the meaning we give to it. It's meaningless. It doesn't care. It's an accident. It's just kind of this movement that it can be explained, as just a kind of an unfolding of physics. And I would say that there are so many refutations of that way of thinking. In the book, again, we can see it in cosmological evolution, purpose, that is, cosmological evolution, biological evolution, and of course, cultural evolution. It's present, it's evident, purposiveness is evident in the what we found out about the laws of physics, right? They're fine-tuned for life. This argument is made by many people. It's been made for the last 50 years. But the book Why by Philip Goff came out in 23. He makes some really the most powerful arguments I've seen for the chief defeater of the fine tuning is this idea of the multiverse. That in other words, yeah, our universe may appear to be fine tuned for life, but that's only because we're one of an infinite number of universes. We just happen to hit the cosmic jackpot. So we can explain away the apparent purposiveness in the constants of physics as it's just random, right? But that is the most ludicrous kind of bad theology. And Goff, who's not a religionist, he's basically coming from a purely philosophical perspective for the most part. He uses Bayesian logic to show that the idea of a multiverse is not really relevant to whether our universe is fine-tuned for life and thus exhibiting purposiveness. All right, so that's a whole discussion in itself. But Purposiveness is highly evident in life because all life is striving to survive and reproduce, right? What's the difference between life and non-life? According to Lynn Margulis, it's life is matter that chooses. Life is agentic. What distinguishes life, it's a metaphysical distinction ultimately. Right? If we try if we look at viruses, we can say, oh, there's a perfect continuum. But I would say that with the emergence of life comes this inherent purposiveness of all animals, that the striving to survive and reproduce, even before you have neurons, right? Amoebas strive to survive and reproduce. And that's a primitive form of goodness. Surviving and reproducing is moving toward the good. So again, there's lots of arguments I make for this. I'm just skimming over the top. And then, of course, purposiveness is in the noosphere, or the realm of human history, because we all feel it directly, right? You and I have purposes. We had a purpose to come and talk together on this Zoom call. I think the idea that humans are purposelessness, or that we're just zombies, or that we have the illusion of purpose, but ultimately it's all predetermined. Again, I think that's ludicrous. I think it flies in the face of our direct experience and what we've seen in the creativity of the noosphere from the beginning of the last 50,000 years, an immense unfolding of purposiveness and inventiveness, and just the initiative and the genius of what humanity has created in terms of the artifacts of the world clearly exhibits purposiveness, right? So I don't want to beat this horse to death, but I would say that they're just from a basic philosophical perspective, that I would argue that the universe is purposive in some way, in some sense. What the purpose of the universe is, that's part of the challenges that can occur within the agreement of support. But if you think the universe is a purposeless accident, I would argue that's a kind of magical thinking that we do well to purge. And that's one of the mechanisms. The spiritual pluralism is not just about us becoming, having social solidarity, although that's probably its highest function. It's also about identifying where the dialectical difference is, right? So, again, there's some ways that it's a seamless continuum, but other ways there's steps, right? Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So if this next step is going to transcend, that involves a dialectical development wherein there's a pushing off against, and that there's a difference there. We don't have to reify the difference, but we need to be aware of it if we're not just going to, always collapse back into New Age spiritual pluralism, right? We want something more rigorous than that, and that involves recognizing that our norm has to say, no, we're not. You can't just be as New Age as you want within this cultural space. We reject that. You can't be Richard Dawkins. That's the philosophy of whoops. We reject that, right? And you can't be a religious fundamentalist that says there's only one true way. Though all of those things are things that need to be kind of kept at bay within this agreement space if there's going to be challenge and support, and thus evolution of the various lines, because we're working the polarity, and the truth of each one of these lines is being improved by the challenges of the other lines and their contradictions. And so then finally, just to kind of put a capstone on what I just said, the idea is that we have an agreement that we're going to work to bridge the dialectical differences, not only between these earlier forms, but also between the way these forms appear in the current space we're trying to create, right? So there are dialectical differences all over the place, right? One way of identifying those is as science, philosophy, and spirituality, right? Again, this is an argument that I make in the book. It's an argument that I made in the February video. But just the idea that these are three legs of a stool, that humanity's approach to truth at this time in history, at least, science is very important, philosophy is very important, and spirituality, religion, very important too. I mean, although it's been discounted, although some would say that religion doesn't deliver any truth, again, that's a form of reductionism or fundamentalism, and so I would say no. And I would say the philosophy's job in this three-legged stool is to both bridge and separate, right? So that philosophy can't be constrained only by what empirical science can reveal, although it certainly should be, challenged by it. In other words, if it contradicts science, so that's a problem. But exactly what is science? There's lots of scientism that's not scientific. It's just scientific materialistic philosophy. So philosophy's ideal role in this function is to both bridge and separate, to keep science from trying to colonize religion, and to keep religion consistent with science. So when science reveals something with some empirical certainty and that contradicts a religious truth, like teaching like six-day creationism, and then those earlier forms, science challenges and purges those earlier ways of seeing. And philosophy's role is to bring them together but keep them apart. Okay, that just concluding here. There's also dialectical differences between progressive, secular, and religious spirituality. And then, of course, a dialectical difference between non-duality and panentheism. But that's a gigantic can of worms that I hope we don't get to. So anyway, that is my little slideshow for now.
Okay, terrific. Well, that was a lot. Thanks for all that work.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, like I said, it's kind of compressing it in.
Yeah.
Thanks for
So
letting
I'll
me
try to probe into each of those agreements a little bit. And I'm going to backtrack a titch to begin that, because when I first came across these, one of the things that interested me in looking at them was how outward facing and kind of socio-political they were. Because a lot of metamodern spirituality, particularly the versions that I've been encouraging, are very much oriented toward inner and intersubjective practice. Right. So we're looking at problems like, what are the functional modules needed for spiritual growth, and what's the vibe and the speech style and the ethos and the affordances necessary for people to gather in practice and communion across traditions. But your angle, and this interested me a great deal, is much more about ensuring productive attitudinal relations and norms between different types of religiosity and different worldview networks that promote or support spirituality. So that was of interest to me. When I was thinking about the lines, and you did a good job of illuminating what those are, very much similar to stage-like or worldview and value system concepts in developmental theory. One of the things that jumped out at me was this difference we sometimes get between where a person is at and what system or culture community they feel embedded in, right? So there's I think a lot of the progress in Western civilization came from people who were deeply embedded in Catholicism or other forms of Christianity, and yet they themselves were at a more sophisticated, let's say, sort of secular, rational, individualistic explorer kind of a mode. But a lot of people who get to that mode don't make the decision to have a rupture and decide they're going to be an atheist or agnostic. They keep their secularism alive, but maintain their role as part of a community and a symbol system and a language and a religious tradition. So when you're thinking of these three lines, how do you adjudicate between people, individuals being at these different lines, and the groups or communities they're embedded in being at these different lines? Like, what is a secular person who's secular about their participation in the Catholic Church, say, right? Is there a different set of lines? Where do you place that person?
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, there's not, one characterization. I mean, there within the history of modernity, right, the majority of folks who identify and are kind of within that cultural center of gravity are not atheists, right? They haven't rejected religion completely. And there's a whole variety of strategies for retaining a degree of loyalty to the line of their cultural origin, let's just say, and their secular rational commitments, right? So,
And
there
you
are
count those
philosophical.
people as being in the first line?
Well, I would say that again, if we think of these not as worldviews, right? There's a traditional worldview, modernist worldview, postmodern worldview, and these are lines. So Catholicism, for example, your what you mentioned, is that there are people who are dyed-in-the-wool Catholics. They believe everything the Pope says. That they're strict Catholics, and when science contradicts their Catholicism, the Catholicism wins, right? And then there are others who say where science contradicts, the religious teachings, the science wins, although the religious teachings still have moral authority, right? Jefferson is an example of it. He was at least purported to be a kind of a deist. He respected Christianity, but wanted to take the best of it and leave the worst. So he actually took a Bible and used the 18th century equivalent of an X-Acto knife and cut out the all the parts of the Bible that were magical thinking according to his, and just the moral precepts of Jesus he left. It's called the Jefferson Bible. You can still get it today. So that's just a concrete example of how, modernists have tried to transcend and include their, religious foundations.
So these lines they have a similarity to stage like and worldview shifts in individuals, but it's a distinct way of categorizing from that, such
Right. The
that there could
worldviews are
be
more ontologically
rational and
Greek.
pluralistic Christians who would still be in line one, so to speak, because they're still participants in something which has multiple forms of itself.
Sure. They could say, look, I'm still a Catholic, but I'm also believe in science. I mean, fairly straightforward, I would say. Or, I believe in social justice and environmental. I have a postmodern values, but I still identify as Catholic because it's kind of my sentimental home.
This is a bit of a tangential question, but it popped up to me looking at your list of examples of progressive spirituality, because one of the most intriguing forms of progressive spirituality for me has been the people who engage in kind of spiritual play or even like creative spirituality, or like we're going to be in the Jedi religion, or like, let's reinvent Wicca, or there's been these like deliberate, often pop culture infused creative movements in progressive spirituality. And sometimes they seem to lack the gravitas of traditional spirituality. But the nice thing that they have is they take seriously the cultural embedding in which people currently find themselves. Because the ancient religions evolved in particular cultural niches, and the religiosity and the spirituality worked with all of the mimetic structures that were available to people in that cultural niche. So if the only book you had was the Quran and you had your personal experiences of different people's stories in life, all of that kind of infused itself into your notion of religiosity. But if you look at the world we exist in now, where even if you're a very traditional person, you're still pretty much exposed to all the vagaries and complexities of the global media culture in some form or another. So you could make the argument that some form of progressive spirituality is the only one which takes seriously the cultural environment in which we actually exist, and that the other lines are refusing to acknowledge that they do exist in this broader social landscape, even though they're interacting with it, and even though it's affecting their own subconscious patterns through which they might have to do some of their spiritual life.
I mean, I would agree partially with that. I
Mm-hmm.
would say that the progressive spirituality needs to be celebrated because it has achieved some significant things. One of which is reframing spirituality as primarily a personal matter, right? Your personal relationship to ultimate reality, your individual path, which doesn't need to correspond to, a monolithic belief system. You can be eclectic, you can be playful, you can be very personal and idiosyncratic in your spiritual experiences. Um, Obviously we could still judge those forms of spirituality by their fruits, right? Ever since, from Jesus to William James, the idea that ultimately the test for whether someone is spiritually developed is the fruits of the Spirit, in their life, and those can be many things. But ultimately, you're judged by that which you create, right, and that which you bring to the world. And so, progressive spirituality has liberated people to rediscover spirituality. The cliche is "let a thousand flowers bloom." And that's been, in some ways a beautiful thing. That's what attracted to me to it from the beginning. I was, when I became, my parents were atheists. And in the 70s, like when I said, I took psychedelics and I began to explore what was at the time, this progressive spirituality. I mean, the characteristics of it, there are some things that are similar, but in some ways it's evolved significantly since the 70s, this cultural space. But the idea that we were taking the best and we were recognizing spirituality from wherever, I think that, that's in the spirit of even the teachings of Jesus in their original form. There's this kind of embracing thing. The ethnocentric exclusivity only comes in when the political pressures of history, contract these religions because they're at war with somebody, so they have to circle the wagons, right? So within American culture and other places in the developed world, we're not at war with other religions. We have this layer of legalistic pluralism, which is very important, and then we have this cultural layer of acceptance. Now we need to go beyond that because while we want to honor everyone's own spiritual path, we don't want to go back into kind of picking winners and losers with any strong sense of certainty. But at the same time, I mean, we need to be able to recognize fundamentalism, reductionism, magical thinking, all of those things.
So, agreement two is around acknowledging and resisting the pathologies of each of these lines. And you've spoken a little bit about the kinds of pathologies that might creep up in these different lines, but I'm curious um, what you would think of as examples of more and less healthy versions of each line. Like what's a healthy and unhealthy example for each of the lines, as far as you're concerned.
Sure. And that's tough because any example I could give would have both the unhealthy and healthy expressions kind of woven together, right? So there's no pure types in this analysis. But certainly one of the ways to think about it is what's known as an inclusivism. The idea that you prefer and you're loyal to your particular spiritual path, but you recognize that there's other forms of spiritual path that have a piece of the truth and that have authentic spiritual experience of something real, right? So the Dalai Lama, he's an inclusivist, right? Or one of the founders of progressive spirituality, Ramakrishna, that was kind of one of his, in the 19th century, one of his realizations was that, there were God-knowing people in every religion and every form of spirituality. And that kind of beginning of an eclectic, form of pluralism, albeit immature in many ways. These are examples of the positives that we can find. I mean, Pope Leo, right, the new Pope. He's seen. I haven't studied, his teachings or anything, but it seems to me my impression, just from the limited news reports that I've heard about him and a couple of articles that I've read, is that he's very ecumenical in his spirit. And even though he has the job of trying to hold the Catholic Church together, he also is open to spirituality, in the same way the Dalai Lama is, even though he represents, Tibetan Buddhism. So examples of the good and the bad. I mean, an example of fundamentalism within secular spirituality. So, I mean, any form of familiar religious spirituality that's fundamentalist, biblical literalist, or Islamic fundamentalism, wherein kill the unbelievers, right? I mean, those are clearly pathological expressions that we can't have in this culture. But again, with secular spirituality, I can point to Sam Harris, right? Many people love Sam Harris, and he certainly, has many intelligent things to say. But Sam Harris is adamant that there's no free will. He's adamant that there's no such thing as beauty, right? So, value realism, Sam Harris denies it. And the interior universe, Sam Harris denies it, or he's obliged to deny it because of his causally closed physicalism, which is this philosophy that he is one of the high priests of. And so again, that's a kind of fundamentalism. Even though Harris brings light, he's also full of shit. So then we could say in progressive spirituality, I hate to be too specific and condemn anybody, but I mean, somebody like Greg Braden, for example, who is a prominent, popular author within progressive spirituality, right? He's promoted by Humanities Team as their number one thought leader. And you look at what he's written, it's chock full of magical thinking and all kinds of claims that pretend to be science but are entirely pseudoscientific. So, I don't want to pick on too many New Age luminaries. I've known a lot of them. I was part of this evolutionary leaders group with Greg Braden and others like Bruce Lipton. And, I mean, again, they're delivering a sense of an enchanted universe to people who are in need of that. And even if the facts might be, that could be wrong as to the facts, but if their heart is in the right place, it's not the worst thing in the world. But as a philosopher, it certainly bugs me that they're so philosophically incoherent and so and dishonoring of science in a way that that I talked about the three legs of the stool, right? They're pretending to be scientific, but it's pseudoscience and it's trying to colonize religion, and so it blends into perennialism, and it's just a mess. So, I don't think I need to go into too much detail about the magical thinking within the New Age culture at the time. It was fluorescent in the 90s, very big. It continued on into the aughts, but I think that its cultural star has definitely set to a degree. And one of the things that's come out of progressive spirituality, it's important for me to say, is that as it's emerged and evolved over the decades, It's become increasingly non-dual in the sense that, non-duality's been there from the beginning. But one of the things we really see now is that many of the leaders, many of the more thoughtful and, kind of intellectually rigorous leaders of progressive spirituality are teaching a form of non-duality that's ultimately a kind of a merger, partial merger at least, between Hinduism and Buddhism, Advaita Vedanta Hinduism and Vajrayana and Zen Buddhism. And they A.H. Almas or Rupert Spira or Adyashanti, they're not teaching Buddhism or Hinduism. They're teaching non-duality as it's evolved and become this kind of overarching agreement about what's ultimately real. And, there's some beautiful expressions of that. Um, and so I wouldn't say that some of these other problems of fundamentalism there's some reductionism, but one of the problems is, of course, belief system imperialism. The idea that non-duality is true and anything that contradicts it is just lower, or delusional. Many of these teachers teach that. And so, some of them are more inclusivist, like they'll recognize other forms of spirituality. And it's natural if you're an inclusivist to want to champion your form of spirituality as the most true, right? That's okay to an extent. But when it bleeds into having to diss or otherwise discount all others and without any epistemic humility, then I would say that that's something that needs to be challenged within this emerging social norm.
Looking at pathologies in the different lines requires us to hold a kind of meta position, but it also requires us to have a sense of what constitutes health and pathology in general. And what you've been mentioning are sort of intellectual attitudinal pathologies, fundamentalism, reductionism, belief system imperialism. There's other
Propositions
elements
of
of
truth,
pathology.
right?
Yeah,
That is,
but
they're more
I'm
than just
wondering
attitude.
about other kinds of pathology like emotional pathology, physical pathology, embedding in pathological social systems. There's lots of other ways to look at what's pathological and to evaluate whether a style of religiosity is pathological or not, right? We might say, oh, well, they're very inclusive in theory, but they're all assholes to deal with, and they support doing, female circumcisions and wars, and none of them are eating properly or things like that. How do you think about other dimensions of pathology relative to these three
Sure.
lines?
Well, there's, like the opposite of vices or, the opposite of virtues, like arrogance, right? That's one of them. Narcissism, is another one. Psychological dispositions, which there's, relative agreement are unhealthy or undesirable. And, anger, right? Sort of warlike, hostility, all the opposites of pluralism in general.
Okay.
I
Agreement
mean, there's a
three
lot more to
is
say
about
about that, but
epistemic
I'm not sure
humility.
where, what you want to get at.
Yeah, no, that's one. It's a half-formed query for me. I'll be thinking
Okay.
about that one some more. Around the notion of epistemic humility, maybe I'll throw out a couple of ideas that I have around that topic, and I'll see how you respond to them. One of the first things that comes up for me that I talk about in metamodern spirituality circles a lot is the word seems, and I borrowed that from Trung Pa in the way he talked, right? And it feels like if you use the word seems, then we secure an interperspectival space of potential conviviality with each other. If I say that I was absorbed into the infinite, you have to believe me or disagree with me. But if I say it seemed like I was, then we can continue to have a productive conversation despite differences of opinion. Very simple tactic in terms of a speech etiquette. What's your feeling about something like that?
Sure. As far as it goes, if you needed to use just one word, insert into the sentence, I think seems is good. I think it's an expression of epistemic humility or a degree of respect for the other, because again, owning your own belief system and not asserting it as an empirical fact seems does that. But again, you don't want to discount your own experience, right? The deep religious experiences were just things that just seemed. I think that's kind of, I mean, again, these are subtle shades, so it's hard to make hard lines between them. But it seems might be a little reductionistic, but I think it would work in most circumstances.
Yeah, I think it's a good for everybody. It could be a good conversational etiquette. For people's experience of themselves, it gets more complicated because some people uh, feel that the vitality and legitimacy of their experiences at risk if they use a concept like that. And other people feel like those kinds of concepts, like seems, are completely compatible with the full legitimacy of their experience. So it gets very tricky.
Well, especially when we get to the the apogees of spiritual experience, right? So when you have a samadhi experience, it doesn't seem like oneness; it is oneness, right? Or emptiness,
Yes,
right?
but then that depends on the valence that we give to the word seems,
Right,
right?
sure, of
Because
course. And
there's a
that's why
lot of
they fall.
expressions of those experiences that amplify the luminosity of the ambiguity, so to speak.
Right. That word can only hold so much weight, right?
Yeah.
When I've experienced the love of God, it didn't. I mean, I could say it. It seemed like there was an intelligent deity that was recognizing me and loving me, but I don't want to discount that too much. So again, these are quibbles. I think seems is a good functional word for a culture of spiritual pluralism.
The second thing that I thought of was sort of um, the value of steel manning or something like that, making an etiquette of the effort to understand the other person and get some coordinates of mutual agreement before passing judgment. Right. It seems that a lot of what we need from epistemic humility is just the inner gesture of temporarily bracketing our first and most practiced evaluations until we've considered the shape and the virtues involved in another person's perspective. But that's a complicated thing, right? It's cognitively and emotionally costly to do that, and it requires a certain facility with as if thinking. And we might not be able to expect that people, maybe particularly the traditional religious, are capable of or willing to make that investment. So, how do we practically establish a normative ethos of epistemic humility, given the different types of capacities among these three lines, or among people who might inhabit these three lines? Because not everybody's equally capable of doing the moves that are required for higher level epistemic humility.
Sure, I think advanced level steel manning in terms of challenging different spiritual truth claims. I mean, that's what this agreement of support looks like, right? I mean, in other words, if we're creating a culture of support, that would be one of the practices in that culture we'd want to try to get better and better at. And you could spend the rest of your life studying your opponent's religion to get the full steel man. And even people with their own spiritual paths who studied it have misconceptions about those paths. So again, that's a good practice, and I applaud it and support it. It can be difficult to do, especially if there's emotional tension going on. The other thing I would say about that is that while ideally we would aspire to a form of spiritual transcendent, beyond legalistic or new age, a form of spiritual pluralism that could eventually serve as a norm for the larger society, but we don't have the power to inculcate such a norm or present such a norm. Our opportunity is to create a norm for this emerging nascent culture of, the post-postmodern. And if we can get that done, we should pat ourselves on the back, because it doesn't exist now in any kind of significant way. Again, we sort of revert back to New Age spiritualism, but again, many of the challenges of the New Age, which have been positive, are they go too far, right? They don't just challenge, they reject, and that would violate the agreement. There's got to be, if these lines are validated in some ways by their noosphere expression itself, right? This merger of Hinduism and Buddhism, I think that'll be seen in the future as something roughly equivalent to the Protestant Reformation, right, in the 17th century. That there are millions of people involved, and it's impacting the world, and it's having a historical effect. So, I would say that there's something real about progressive spirituality, and it can't just be swept under the rug, because the spiritual experience of it and the fruits of its, the spiritual fruits that it's born are perfectly evident in the historical and cultural record. And the same with religious spirituality, even more so with religious spirituality. But again, these are things that I'm inviting people to investigate, and I'm glad we're investigating it to some degree now. But obviously, this is something that has to occur over time and be worked out by many people besides just us.
Um, One more thing, and this comes from my leaning is toward the more extreme side of the epistemic humility in terms of like kind of pushing that right into the ontological condition, or with my metaphysics of adjacency and these various other things I do. But I find I'm very careful when I articulate the limit of knowing. I just wrote this article called The Complex Feeling of Being, which was a play off Wilbur's Simple Feeling of Being. And what I ended up saying at the end was it's not the case that there is definitely a mystery that exceeds all knowing, because it's more mysterious than that. It's that we cannot definitively know whether there is such a mystery or not. Right now, that's a very subtle tweaking, but what it does is it puts the limit on us rather than allowing us, despite encountering the limit, to then assert the factuality of a rash and totalizing claim about what goes beyond that limit. It's a very delicate
Rash and
thing. I
totalizing.
certainly
I
have a
like that.
preference.
Well, okay, first of all, I don't think there's any question that we certainly don't know everything, right? At least not again, the personal experience and personal certainty is one thing, but collectively, there's certainly no agreement at this time in history, within humanity or even within, postmodern culture, post-postmodern culture, about what's spiritually true, about what the source of the universe is, what the destiny of our lives is, about whether there's life after death, all kinds of spiritual questions which are far from settled at this point. So there's no question that we don't know everything. The question of can we know everything, that's an interesting question. My take on it is that we can't, because we're humans, that we're in this body. Now, if we allow for an afterlife or some kind of spiritual ascension beyond this body, then yeah, we may eventually come into all knowing, right? We may become one with the universe and know everything because we're one with it. And we've achieved that. Or we may come, to go to heaven, right? And be debriefed about what really the truths of the world are. However you might conceive of it, I think that it is, conceivably possible that we could come into all knowledge, but we'd certainly have to be at a much higher level of evolution in terms of the consciousness. Human consciousness at this time in history, and probably for all future times in history, has limitations, right? With that, and whether there'll be, the clouds of mystery will part. I think that's one of the most amazing things that science has brought us, that it's shown us as the universe is deeply intelligible. That by itself is a spiritual truth. And the idea that it's deeply intelligible is that we can get closer to truth. Whether there's an end to it or not, that's a deep theological discussion that I think is beyond your question.
Yeah, or maybe is at the heart of my question, because like obviously we can get closer to truth, and we don't know the limit of what we can learn. And then at the same time, we have spiritual access to phenomenologies in which we exceed the duality between knowledge and ignorance, let's say. All right. There's certain kinds of experiences that could be described as absolute certainty, or at the very least, they exceed what we normally think of as knowing and not knowing. But all of that seems to me embraced by this notion that not that we can't ever know everything, but that we can't ever know whether we can know everything or not. Like that's the epistemological limit if we're going to take the humility seriously. We can't know whether we can ultimately know or not.
Yeah, at least, as long as we're here and it's just us humans and we don't have access to, real-time communication with a superhuman intelligence, one way of putting it, is that, that we're behind a veil here on Earth. And while I think we can have confidence, I think one of the ways that we can go beyond, one of the ways at least conceiving of what going beyond, or embracing the mystery, or wrestling with the question of can we know the mystery, is the nature of faith, right? At least it's taught, kind of in an Abrahamic religious context, is that it's a kind of super knowing. By faith, you transcend the limits of what humans can know and make contact with something that can give you assurance while still being just, bracketed as faith, right? So I don't assert my faith as some empirical thing, but I think that through faith, I can trust in something that's bigger than I can understand.
Yeah, my intuition and experiences and predilection of mind lead me towards saying something like the divine takes the form of the veil, not the form of what's on the other side of the veil. But it's not clear to me whether I completely believe that or whether what I want to do is problematize the space of discussion around these things so that they can be more fertile and novel.
Well, highly relevant to that concept is the analysis of Charles Taylor,
Mm-hmm.
the Hegelian philosopher. He talks about the horizon of transcendence and how that we live in an immanent frame, but the frame of immanence within modernity and scientific naturalism the frame itself is where transcendence lies, right? And that we can expand that frame and go beyond. That we're intuiting stuff coming from either the frame or beyond the frame. And that we're just shutting out crucial features of it, and Taylor makes some excellent arguments along those lines.
Okay, agreement four. The difference between belief systems and established facts. Yeah, a statement like that, it seems like the word established is doing a lot of heavy lifting because the different lines, resonant maybe with different worldviews, value systems, and histories, tend to make different kinds of assumptions about how facts are established. And then you add on top of that the currently emerging information landscape that calls all of the classic procedures for establishing consensus into question. So, how on earth do we, going forward into a landscape of spiritual pluralism, get agreement about the valid establishment of facts, especially between these different lines? Like, how is that even feasible?
Sure. I'm glad you pointed that out. I mean, the more philosophically accurate term would be establishing facts, because it's a verb more than a noun. And clearly, there are very few things we could say are established facts because we live in this, culture of skepticism, and some of that's very healthy, right? Let's, if we've got a proposition of truth, let's pour acid on it and see what's left, right? And deconstructionists, some postmodern philosophers would have us believe that nothing is really an established fact except deconstruction, right? In other words, everything's untrue. There's no truth except that the statement that I'm saying, which is there is no truth, right? It's a performative contradiction, which is part of the established frame of postmodernism. But again, they're moving towards antithesis, and they get there by having an agreement that they're going to just question everything, and that by itself can lead to pathology. But as a move that is partially subversive, that breaks the old frame, it serves a useful function in the evolution of the noosphere. But we can't wallow in antithesis forever. We have to move to the synthesis if we're not going to destroy ourselves, right? But what is established facts? I mean, I guess there are levels of this, right? So we could say one of the established facts is that we live in at least, these North American democracies, and that within these North American democracies, established fact is that we have a government, that we have a constitution, that there are laws, that people are breaking these laws, that we're trying to devolve the laws. There's sort of the political reality, and although that's certainly contentious, we might find some core of it in there that we could say, look, these things are just true, right? And the same thing with science, right? It's an emerging thing. Science is constantly questioning its own assumptions. It's growing larger. It maintains this attitude of skepticism and revision. It's part of the method of science. And yet, I'd say there are certain things that science delivers, like the sun is rising. It's not a flat earth, right? These are kind of, there's a core of agreement, but there's no hard line around where that edge is. And playing with that edge is part of what evolution's all about. So I'm just saying, like, for the purposes of that agreement is like, for example, if you're at a workshop at some integral conference and people are talking, right? And they're all of a sudden talk about, the flat earth, as if we all know that the earth is flat. And that flies in the face of our agreement regarding the heliocentric solar system. Again, there are places which it's plainly true and places where it's problematic, and you can't say there are established facts. So I'm just kind of throwing that out there. Part of it is the agreement itself. Like, what are our cultural agreements, right? Does our cultural agreement includes that non-believers should be executed? That would be us outside the established facts of our cultural we space. And so honoring the core elements of that we space, I'd say it's kind of intuitive, but again, it's more illuminated by that other agreement where I talk about owning your belief system, right? And so again, these are not absolute, black and white concepts.
Yeah, it's flexible and it's an ongoing dynamic thing. And for me, I guess the most important part is for the individuals who are going to participate in something like postmodern spiritual pluralism that they at least are open to a distinction between their beliefs and their facts. It's like if you want to talk to somebody about cinema, if they don't make a distinction between good movies and movies they happen to like, you can't really have a deep cinematic discussion with them,
That's an
right?
excellent
Or if a
analogy. Yeah,
yeah,
that illustrates it well.
okay. So the fifth agreement, the one that probably, like you were saying, is going to require the most collective digging into going forward if we were going to establish agreements of this kind, is the one around affirm the interior universe, value realism, and the universe's purposiveness, which is a great word, purposiveness. So we'll
Say
break
it three
those
times
down into
fast.
sections. um, I think a lot of people would probably push back around the interiority aspect of like ontological subjectivity and intersubjectivity, right? And whether or not it's possible to do legitimate spirituality without those assumptions. Now, I make those assumptions, so I'm not going to push on that. The thing I'm intrigued by is what does affirm mean, right? Like what in order to decide whether or not someone affirms the interior universe, what would you look for? Is it purely a verbal gesture of saying that we accept it? Or could someone live it but make the opposite claim? Like, what would you look at in the case of an individual to see whether they gave any evidence of affirming an interior universe?
Right. Well, a good example there would be free will, or at least relatively, some degree of non-complete determinism, right? And everybody presupposes in practice that they have free will. Everybody gets up in the morning and makes choices, and if unless they're corrupted by philosophy, they believe that they don't just create value by their choices. That some things really are better than others, and they're capable of getting it wrong. So the idea that there's free, but of course, Sam Harris, again, my favorite whipping boy, right? There's no free will. He's got all these whole cluster of arguments about it. We see the media holding up others who come along and saying neuroscience shows there's no free will. Um, Free will's, I mean, it's kind of a can of worms because it's so kind of absolutistic and because it's got so many arguments against it, and because there's a large scale agreement within modernity, within at least, reductive physicalism about its, illusory nature. Um, and so I think we could debate to the extent to which our wills are free, to the extent that we're clearly there's determinism and there's also I see degrees of freedom in the universe because again you get back to the causally closed reductionism. It's a slippery slope to that if you're going to deny that consciousness has some reality and it has some causal efficacy, right? You don't have to necessarily go all the way to the uncaused cause of human free will, that somehow the subjective awareness pushes around the particles in our brain that makes us raise our hands, right? I mean, this is an interesting debate. I certainly have, a horse in that race. But I would say that if you just say consciousness is I mean, Daniel Dennett, right, another one of the four horsemen of the atheism, right? He says consciousness is an epiphenomenon, right? That it's not real. I mean, if you just listen to Dennett and his arguments, they're ludicrous, they're ridiculous, they're fundamentalism. And if you want to see like a thoroughgoing refutation of that way of thinking, then read David Bentley Hart's latest book, All Things Are Full of Gods. He just dismantles this stuff, and you don't have to be a religionist to recognize how powerful those arguments are in demonstrating the falsity of reductionism.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned degrees of freedom. I usually say that I believe in the possibility of a freer will as sort of a functional option. But
Right,
I'm really
let me just
curious.
inject that
Yeah,
Maslow was one of the first to say, as people develop psychologically, their wills become more free. They're
yeah,
less determined through the evolution of
yeah,
consciousness.
yeah. This was Gurdjieff's argument as well in the early 20th century.
Maybe
Um,
maybe Maslow got it from Gurdjieff,
it's possible. Maybe they both stole it from Nietzsche. Uh,
or maybe they both realized the truth of it independently. Right?
um, it's interesting to me because it seems like you mentioned that everybody behaves de facto as if they have free will regardless of the intellectual opinion they hold about the cosmos, and it may be that it's um, like if everything was completely determined, and yet completely determined looks and functions exactly like this, and this behaves as if we have some kind of freedom, or as if our intentionality has real effects, then what difference does that make, right? If you were to hold free will in an as if position and go, ultimately, I don't think there is any, but it behaves as if there is. So that's fine. That's how I behave. Does that bar you from fundamentally participating in postmodern spiritual pluralism, or is that kind of irrelevant in some ways?
I think that's an excellent question. I think the fine details of that are what this challenge and support process is all about, right? I mean, I have my opinion, but again, we're trying to create a social norm where we can forge agreement around that. And I'm not going to create, postmodern spiritual agreement by just asserting things. I might, if I get it right, make a powerful argument that persuades people. But at the same time, so it goes back to what you said about the mystery, and whether the edge is the mystery itself or whether the mystery is beyond, or, I think that we can say that that while we have apparent freedom, while freedom seems to be necessary for our participation in the unfolding of the universe, right? That why are we here? If we're here just to go along for the ride and we have no choice in the matter, or we have no efficacy in the evolution of the universe, then I mean that certainly problematizes all kinds of spiritual aspirations and spiritual truths. But I would say at the same time, we can problematize the idea of straightforward human freedom by looking at something like providence, right? I mean, we don't have to go to the full-blown physicalist block universe that time is an illusion and it's just everything is fixed. I think it's more mysterious than that. I think providence itself, it's not it doesn't have to be interpreted as predetermination or a block universe. I think providence could be seen as in some ways a future echo that is time is is an affordance for consciousness, and that beyond time there's something where there's a function of providence, but we certainly can't reconcile it with freedom, and it creates a mystery which I think philosophy can approach, but ultimately we have to go deeper. I think we're going to need non-conceptual thinking supplied by religion and spirituality to be able to grapple with that mystery more effectively than a rationalistic philosophy can do.
Okay, value realism. Now, this is a place where I tend to take a kind of a tricky agnostic position, which is, um, as far as I can tell, I will always experience value, and every experiencer will always experience value. And I don't know that I can say it precedes experiencers, but it does seem to me that value is at least as fundamental as experiences. Wherever any experiencer shows up, value is already there. Right now, did it arrive the moment they arrived, or was it there before them? I feel like I don't necessarily have to make a decision about that. But my real question, the thing that interests me when you were talking about it was, like you mentioned, established and establishing, right? It's sort of like a static and a dynamic alternative here. So when we talk about value realism, are we talking about static or dynamic values in terms of these values just exist fundamentally eternally, or these values came to exist? Other values could come to exist objectively or through our co enactment processes, in which case spirituality may then play a role in active value creation or discovery. How do you feel about that?
I think this is excellent observation. I can say unequivocally that value is the more dynamic, that it's not simply objective, that it's not some static thing that's there like an object that we discover. I think one of the goals of this book that been working on is to make value more real, right? To make arguments for value realism by reconceiving value in a way that breaks out, escapes these metaphysical categories of objective, subjective, and intersubjective. I think I characterize value as the direction of evolution. In other words, the process of making progress toward the more real, right, or the more true, good, and beautiful, and that form of progress can't be reduced to any one of these. It's not simply objective. It's not simply subjective. It kind of plays above those categories, uniting them and arising from their interaction, right? But that's a very deep subject that I can't really unpack in a conversation like this.
Yeah,
I would need
yeah,
to make a slideshow presentation and, really kind of start from the
yeah.
beginning with my
Yeah.
thesis of value realism. But I can certainly affirm that it's certainly not some static thing that's waiting to be discovered.
Yeah, well, let's definitely get into that sometime because I find that there's a number of thinkers who are resistant to the idea of value realism, but not as resistant to the idea of valuing realism in that sense, right? I think they're more open to the dynamic version of it.
Well, they're presupposing in
Nonetheless, yeah,
practice that there is a more real, that there is a true and less
exactly.
true and more true. So again, the idea that there is no value, it's self-refuting.
One of the things I point to usually around metamodern spiritual practice or like setting up practice spaces is there's very simple things we can do, like contemplative sitting together, which is regardless of our tradition or our specific inner practice, right? So it's something we can do that is developmental and spiritualizing and straddles all these things without requiring anybody to switch to anything else. Right. So there's these very simple, but necessarily then very general kinds of practices that can be done. In that vein, I liked the notion of agreeing about purposiveness, without necessarily having to agree about what that purpose is specifically. But I'm curious how specific or non-specific you think that purposiveness might have to be. Like, how much of a particular kind of purpose to the cosmos do you think we would have to agree on versus just agreeing? Like, does everybody who thinks there's a purpose get to enter into this postmodern spiritual pluralist communion, or do you have to be a little bit more precise in the kind of purpose of this that you agree to?
Another excellent question. I would want to allow for as much pluralism regarding purpose as possible. I don't want to necessarily set myself up as a gatekeeper, for who's in and who's out of post-progressive spirituality. But I certainly can feel threatened when there are elements of these earlier worldviews, fundamentalisms or reductionisms that attempt to pull the rug out from my spiritual loyalties or make me feel like I'm excluded. I've encountered that plenty in many different spaces. Some, expressly integral and some not. But I would say that's exactly the kind of thing that we need to work out. I don't think that we can say beforehand we've already figure that out, and this is the degree of purpose you have to believe in if you're going to be part of our club, right? I think that we can, that as folks feel that purpose is problematic, let's have those arguments within an environment of support where we can respect them. That's part of the problem of secular spirituality. Let me just kind of cut to the chase on this. Is that while there are many very intelligent people, right, who are attracted to the postmodern culture, who are in that space, it's been difficult for some of them to escape this culture of contempt, this culture of debunking, right? This kind of the arrogance of scientism is a kind of baggage that secular spirituality has not, adequately purged. So when voices in this larger subculture basically say that the universe is meaningless and that that anybody who has predilections toward progressive spirituality or religious spirituality is delusional and full of shit, then that's a kind of a crude example of the kind of thing that we would have to say, well, geez, that by itself is fatal to spiritual pluralism, right? The support is skewered by that in a way that makes the idea that we would, in good faith, talk about what level of purposiveness is minimal for this agreement. Again, that has to take place. I could certainly, enter into that argument with enthusiasm, but I would need to do it with an interlocutor who is less recognizing of purpose than you.
Yeah. Yeah, I can get pretty near purposelessness, but the way I do it ends up having the purpose sort of built into, or fundamentally like non-dually, like non-differentiated from it. As far as I can tell, meaning and meaninglessness are not fundamentally separable concepts. right? To assert
Too much Nietzsche.
meaninglessness.
Too
Yeah,
much Nietzsche.
exactly.
Overload.
Exactly. Okay.
Just kidding.
Last agreement. Working to bridge dialectical differences through support and challenge. First of all, I commend you on including challenge, which is something which people with progressive sympathies often overlook.
Otherwise, we're just new
Um,
age. There's no
exactly.
challenge. Yeah.
But I would love for the listeners to get a more clear sense. Maybe you could give some examples of what you mean by some dialectical differences and what some bridges might be, so that they have like a more concrete sense of what this refers to.
Well, we've been talking about them, right? Is value real? Is consciousness real? Does it have its own causative influence on the rest of the world? Is there free will? Does the universe have a point? Is the universe pointless? I mean, without, if you say that there's no purpose to the universe, even though there's purpose at every level and different manifestations of purpose, it's almost like that's kind of flirting with the denial of establishing facts, right? So, we have physics. It's kind of an established fact, although we want to continually pour acid on it. And, many of the paradigms will be overturned in the future, and we know all that. The fact that there are these constants of physics and they're poised on a knife edge, that's a fairly established science at this point. The meaning of it is debatable within different philosophies. But if you say that there are no constants in physics and science is an illusion, then that would be, an example of something that's, kind of beyond the pale. It's kind of a conversation stopper, right? Because there's no mutual ground at which you can stand, right? Or if you say that, like Descartes, animals are just machines, right? They're just, like grinding of the wheels in his famous passage. And that they have no heart, they have no purpose, they have no intention, that they're not really making any choices. I would say that at this point we can establish that the part of the foundation of our recognizing the moral duty toward other life forms is recognizing at least partially their significance, their spiritual and moral significance, and part of that comes from the fact that they're sentient and then they're agents. And that they have, they're striving to survive and reproduce, and they can fail, right? They can die. So, I mean, again, examples of where the challenge can occur. I guess I mentioned it earlier, right? Assertions by thought leaders vying to become leaders in this postmodern space that the universe is meaninglessness, despite all appearances to contrary. Again, I want to challenge that ruthlessly, not because it might be wrong, but because it undermines everything. It ends the conversation in terms of support and challenge, because implicit in that assertion is that any attempt to find meaning or make contact with transcendence, which is what all these other lines are trying to do in their own way, that's all invalid. And so, that's an example of a challenge that is necessary for us to create some kind of culture that goes beyond atheism.
I hear in this, it seems to me that there's something very personal about Steve in all of this, which is like point six is kind of yes, it's a general social point, but there's also, I hear a guy saying, listen, I'm willing to engage in all of these arguments and discussions, provided we don't do these things that shut those arguments and discussions down. I'll play back and forth in the struggle between these polarities as long as we don't do the things that cut off the validity of the discussion. Now,
Or
when it
put
comes,
down those
yeah,
who hold these spiritual loyalties that are carefully thought out, directly experiential and, rational for sure.
now my question is, what do we mean by a bridge? Is a bridge simply the condition under which we have these dialectical discussions in ways that don't shut down or demean people? Or is a bridge something like synthetic that we have to construct going forward that supersedes or includes or integrates the elements in these dialectical discussions?
The bridge is an intersubjective reality. It's kind of a system of agreement that is formed by the recognition of a common purpose, right?
Okay.
So we have the common purpose, even though we have different spiritual paths, we have the common purpose of wanting to participate in and maybe even contribute to
Mm-hmm.
this next great phase of human history, right? The next emergence beyond progressive postmodernism. Something comes next. The logic is simple. And so we want to be part of that, right? We're called to figure out what that is and work it out. And the way cultures are worked out is there are arguments and there are agreements, and that's where this ontological intersubjectivity that we talked about at the beginning comes back in. We're trying to create a new worldview. Now, we're not going to socially engineer it, but we can recognize things that are going to kill the agreement or the set of agreements that's going to enact that worldview. And again, that comes back to what we talked about from the beginning, and that is this social norm, this agreement, this bridge between different estimations of what's ultimately real. That we can say, look, in this culture, we're going to have more than one concept of ultimate reality. We're going to have more than one spiritual path. But we're also going to try to refine and improve every path that comes in by subjecting them to this new kind of pluralism where there's respectful challenge and also, implicit and often explicit support.
So that what I hear is a kind of triangulation, let's say, right? If the polarized disagreement options are going at each other like this, the bridge is them agreeing that this occurs in the context of something going this way, some kind of progressive directionality that they can both participate in without necessarily having one of those two sides defeat the other.
Sure. I mean, if you're going to say that there is that the noosphere is evolving, that we can see these structures of history and they're still extant now, and we can see this pattern and we see that there's something comes next, that by itself has all kind. I mean, if you're going to just agree that that's a possibility, then that has all kinds of assumptions built into it, which are mostly unexamined, right? Including, ontological intersubjectivity, the evolution of consciousness, the evolution of the universe, the reality of value, that something can be more inclusive or even higher. All of these things are kind of built in there and they're in the background and we take them for granted, but there are many examples of fundamentalism that use those, presuppose those in practice, but yet deny them for either, shock value or just for the sake of being radical or to be attractive to people who want to be black and white, right? There's many people who are challenged by complexity in a way that even if it's, in a postmodern guise, this kind of absolute certainty of good and bad, it appeals to their evolutionary psychology. It appeals deep down. So it's easy to kind of get followers and attract an audience if you're being radical. But ultimately, if you're doing so in a way that is founded on these underlying agreements that I just mentioned and refuting them, but using them at the same time, it becomes a kind of hypocrisy.
Well, we're coming near the end of this. There's so many different subtleties at the edges of each piece of this that I would love to dive into, and maybe we can do that at some point. I'd love to talk more about fundamentalism, reductionism, and perennialism. I'd love to talk more about esoteric and exoteric, because I think that's really interesting. Once you take out the idea that you can just mine the naive experiences of the mystics to get a fixed set of perennial secrets, then what does esoteric practice consist of if some members of the population are especially oriented toward esoteric practice? And how can we rethink it around their behaviors and protocols and not around the content of their perceptions or all sorts of different interesting things? That's just one example.
Right, and that's one of the ways that this
yeah.
one of the good things that once we get some momentum of postmodern spirituality, that's one of the most excellent things that it can do with new clarity. Right, all of the agreements that allow us to transcend into this new emerging cultural space give us superpowers to be able to re-examine esoteric spirituality with new clarity, right, and with new challenges and new support.
So that's an invitation, I guess. If there, at any point you want to go into the most obscure and subtle aspects of these things, I'd love to do that. But here we are at the end because somebody did a 45-minute slideshow and ate up most of our time. And it was great. I guess the last thing I want to say here is like how this fits into a bigger picture, right? So I think there needs to be a kind of quasi-formal collegial alliance network between people who are working on the evolutionary multi-value spirituality scene.
That's a nice
It
way to
doesn't
put
have
it.
to be deep agreement, doesn't have to be endorsement, doesn't have to be high trust heart bonding, although it can be those things, but it has to be like a basic big tent network that facilitates information discoveries and resources being circulated between hubs that are operating in this general area for the general well-being. So I think right now, this interview is an instance of that kind of a network. And I'm going to consider it to be part of a loose alliance between integral post metaphysical spirituality, meta modern spirituality, and post postmodern spiritual pluralism. And what do you think about that?
I think that sounds great. I'm interested in all these things, and as long as there's a degree of respect, that I'm not completely full of shit, or that I'm not a threat, or neither are you, or if we disagree, then we're just flat wrong and delusional. I think that's I think conversations like this are putting building bricks in the wall of what this next emergent culture can and I would say should be.
Well, I hereby affirm that Steve McIntosh is not completely full of shit.
Well,
uh,
what heartfelt endorsement.
that's high praise coming from me.
Well, back at you, bro.
All right. This has been great, Steve. Thanks for
Thank you,
guiding
Layman.
us through an exploratory, hopefully introductory deep dive, because this is a conversation that's going to unfold for quite a while, I think.
Sure, we can do it again, and hopefully when my new book comes out.
Great. Good to see you, man.
Okay, man.